Okay, this is Canon Law I, still in semi-exile, video 4, September 16th, 2020. Lesson 4, we're in part 3, but we're only going to be talking about part of part 3. As I've told you, this third part of lesson 4 is one of our more challenging, maybe the most challenging thing that we've got to do this semester. What we're eventually going to do in part 3 of this lesson is end up with a chart. This is hard to see, but when I email it to you, it'll be easier to read on your machines. And we're also going to create it on the board. And the purpose of it is to distinguish different types of enactments depending on whether the person has legislative, executive, or judicial power in the church. That we were going to do that on Friday the 17th, but I won't. Or probably will not be present. So we'll do it on Tuesday the 22nd. We should have plenty of time, but just to be sure, we're going to try to get out of the way some of the preliminary parts of the lesson so that we can focus on creating this chart together in class. And then after class, right after class, I'll actually send you my copy of this chart. You may actually want to create it anew yourself because, again, as with the timeline by Father Plessala, I'm sure many of you could create something more pleasing to the eye than is within my capabilities. Anyway, we have in the church, as you know, in civil law, especially the U.S. Constitution, we talk about the separation of powers. We talk about something similar in the church. We don't talk about the separation, but the distinction of powers. And we even call them the same or similar things to what we call them in civil law. In civil law, we'll talk about legislative, executive, and judicial. Legislative, making laws; executive, enforcing laws; judicial, judging disputes that arise about the laws. In the church, and again, this is really a European feature of the church's law, the code law. Again, we have a code in the church. Code is especially distinctive of European continental systems. Often what we would call executive in the Anglo-American context is going to be called administrative. So we're going in talking about power in the church. When we're talking about just the ordinary things that a bishop does in ruling the diocese day to day, it might seem from the American parallel like we'd use the word executive, and you can use that, but it probably would be somewhat more common in the church to use administrative or even to use both. I've got a note under here that says executive administrative power can be delegated sometimes. By contrast, legislative power can never be delegated. Judicial power can never be delegated. That's kind of the object of this little very abbreviated part of a lesson, is to talk especially about legislative power and judicial power because they're relatively straightforward. The reason this is a challenging part of a lesson is because the executive administrative part makes it challenging. So we're going to try to get some of the material, especially on legislative power, out of the way. Or it doesn't have to be out of the way. You can ask questions about it, but at least we've got a foundation to that we can use for our discussion. Okay. When we ask what a law is, I'm going to kind of give you two definitions, and they're pretty similar, but they highlight slightly different things. The first one is from a Spanish canonist I've mentioned before, Jose Tomas Martin Degar, and he's done a kind of a competing introductory canon law text that if we weren't using Woodall, we would be using Martin Degar. His is also a fine text to use. And his definition is a really nice definition of a law, what a law is. A general norm promulgated by one with legislative power. Now, when we say a norm usually means something that actually governs us. It's more binding on us than a mere policy or a mere guideline. So when we think of, it's kind of hard to tell the difference between laws and norms, except to say that a norm is going to be probably a more general category. And there will be other norms that are not legislative, but that are administrative. That's going to be another difference. But so Martin Degar's good definition, a general norm. General is important. It's a law because it applies broadly. It's for a class of cases. It's not just deciding your dispute. That's what judges do. That's the judicial side, just deciding, is your marriage valid? Did you commit this church crime? A law, a general norm, is broad. It's going to speak broadly and say, if you do this, then you have committed such and such a crime, etc. So a general norm promulgated by one with legislative power. And only a few entities in the church are going to have legislative power. So that's going to be important to remember. Okay, Woodall also gives I think Martin Degar's definition is better, but Woodall's is pretty good, and it's reminiscent of Martin Degar. And this is on page 62. He says a law is a common command, and it is stable, not temporary. I think those are very good points to make. He says it's a common command. Martin Degar says the same thing, but in different words. He calls it a general norm, a common command. General, it's common. It applies to people commonly, not just an individual. And it's a norm. It's really binding. It's a command. It's not only a policy. And he points out, Woodall, that it's stable, not temporary. Martin Degar doesn't quite capture that part of it. I think you would agree. Maybe it's implied in the term general, but it's good that Woodall emphasizes that stability of law. Okay, and then he goes into, Woodall goes into who are legislators in the church, and they are here. They are, especially the Pope, the Roman Pontiff. He can legislate for the whole church. Also, I don't have it on this card, but an ecumenical council, of course, can legislate for the whole church. Who else? Diocesan bishop. Diocesan bishop can make laws. As we said, they don't seem to make laws too often. If they do, they're going to be called particular laws. A law made by the Pope is a universal law. A law made by the diocesan bishop is a particular law. Religious superiors also are legislators. So an abbot could be a legislator. And again, his law is particular law. It's for his community, for his abbey, not for the entire church. And then one other thing we'll list with a asterisk: Episcopal conferences, Conference of Bishops. We have this real danger in the U.S., which is of thinking of the U.S. Conference of Bishops as being like Congress. And Congress, even though we call our government one of limited powers, Congress, practically speaking, there are not that many limits on what Congress can do. It was not intended to be a general legislature, kind of de facto, pretty much what it has become. The bishops' conferences are most definitely not general legislators. When we had if you watched the video on Apostolos Suos that mentioned Apostolos Suos and kind of the history of post-Vatican II friction between the U.S. and the Holy See on liturgy and on some social issues, you may recall that the sort of the power of the conference came into conflict with the power of individual dioceses. So this is very important to remember, not just for law, but even theologically, because we have to be careful of how much authority we give to conferences of bishops, because they're not even entities of divine law, while the bishop is. So the conference can legislate only where it has a specific grant of authority. For instance, setting the age for confirmation. Very, very important to remember. Okay. The next thing Woodall talks about is the promulgation of laws. I think we've really covered this in talking about Thomas. Promulgation isn't just informing people that something's been passed, but that it has the force of law. It's not a mere guideline. As we have talked about before, a universal law, a law of the Pope, is going to be promulgated by publication in the AAS, the Acta Apostolica Sedis. The promulgation of diocesan law, it's going to vary from country to country, maybe even diocese to diocese. I think it would be, again, there's not that much diocesan law. Probably if there were, it would appear at least in the diocesan paper, but hard to speak too generally about diocesan law. We talked about this with Thomas too, vacatio legis, the holiday of the law. And what that means is that's the interval between the time the law is passed and the time that it takes effect. And as we said in class, the point is to give people time to realize this new law is going to be in effect. There almost always is some period, a very common period in the church is 3 months. Not always, though, because especially if we're talking about something that's like a criminal matter, and we're saying that this is a crime, we may put it into effect immediately because we don't want people saying, oh, this will be a crime in 3 months, so if I want to do it, I better do it in the next 3 months. No, we want people to stop doing it entirely. So that's going to be a somewhat different case there. Okay, the vacatio legis, very kind of nice, kind of charming term, holiday of the law. Another thing to know about laws, and this is why we're just kind of getting some of this material out of the way, it's more to orient you about what laws are in the church and where they are, etc. And I think we've talked about this too, but since we're talking about laws, I think it's good to remind ourselves of what we've said so far. There are, when we say canon law, or we say what's canonical and what's not canonical, sometimes some people are going to mean by that just what is contained in the code of canon law, and then sometimes people are going to mean all of church laws. I think we probably will more tend to have the broader understanding, and just to kind of reinforce that, we want to remind ourselves that there are very important areas of law that are outside of the code. CIC, again, is the code, Codex Juris Canonici, so canonical norms or legal norms outside of the code. Liturgy, very important area. The code does talk about liturgy, but most liturgical norms are outside the code. The organization of the Roman Curia, very important to see what they can and can't do, not contained in the code. The causes for canonization and beatification of saints, separate law, not contained in the code. And concordats. Concordats are essentially treaties between the Holy See and different countries, sometimes even different regions of different countries, and those also are not contained in the code. Those are going to probably change too frequently to be put in the code. There's really going to be too many of them. Another thing, again, we've talked about, but I think it's a good reminder for orientation purposes. Woodall calls this on 66 the extent of ecclesiastical laws, and what we're talking about is who is bound by which kinds of laws. So let's just put up a schema here and talk about it. Who is bound? Natural law. Everybody's bound. It's not just Catholics who can't marry once they're already married to a spouse who's still alive, but that's true of all people. Marriage is exclusive by nature. divine law, what Thomas calls divine law, what we're tending to call divine positive law, again, bound by all. So the other day we talked about how Christ gave the church the right and duty to preach everywhere, but some countries like Saudi Arabia don't let us preach. Christ is Lord of the universe, and so this is something even non-Catholics are bound. This is an injustice, even though the in Saudi Arabia is an Islamic country. It's not a Christian country. All or almost all of the Christians there are visitors or visiting workers, but still, this is still unjust for Saudi Arabia to bar the preaching of the gospel, because this norm is from divine law, from the Lord himself. And then our last category, merely ecclesiastical laws. These are the parts of canon law. Now again, keep in mind, canon law is going to contain all three. Canon law cannot enact natural law, cannot enact divine positive law, but it can repeat it. And so when we have it in a canon, it's repeating those things. But also, the larger part of the code is going to be merely ecclesiastical laws, human laws, canon law as human law. Who's bound by those? Only Catholics, and they have to be at least 7 years old and have the use of reason. Who has to marry according to canonical form? Who has to marry in front of a priest or deacon? Catholics, not Saudi Arabians, not Lutherans, etc. Okay. Now we want to talk about a little more specifically about laws. We said normally only the Pope or the full college of bishops, that is, the bishops gathered in ecumenical council, can legislate for the whole church, because they're the only ones that have legislative power. The only real exception to that is if the Pope should give a mandate to some group to legislate. When would he do this? One example where you might see him doing this would be maybe in connection with the Synod of Bishops. The Pope might give a faculty to the bishops to legislate on an issue. I don't think the popes have ever done that, though. Certainly not recently, but I don't think they ever have given the authority to the bishops gathered in synod to legislate. But that might be a possibility. We talked about particular law, and here's a term that Woodall should discuss, but he doesn't. On page 69 of Woodall, this is some of the material that we said was kind of optional. Page 69 is kind of misleading, so you might even be better off skipping it, and some of what Woodall says about administrative decrees. There's a kind of document called a general decree. In this, if you look at Canon 29 and 30, they say it is a true law. Note the word general. It's a general decree, so it applies generally. So what the canons say is that a general decree is a true law. So when you see general decree, think law. Unfortunately, there's another term that's very similar, but has a very different meaning, and it's a GED. We sometimes call a general decree a GD. Another term is GED, General Executory Decree. That is different. That's an administrative type of measure. We'll talk about that when we do our chart. This is something that is not clear in Woodall. So this is one of the reasons why we're partly on our own in sort of creating our chart and in sorting through what counts as a law, what the difference between these types of enactments is. Okay. So remember when we started, we talked about three things. We've got legislative, judicial, and executive or administrative. We've just talked about legislative, and we're going to move away from it now, and we're going to move to judicial, and only just say a couple of things about judicial. We said a fair amount about legislative, just not nearly as much to say about judicial. Here we're talking about judicial acts. Keep in mind, we're using the word judicial here, not the word juridical. We're going to use the word juridical, but just keep in mind, judicial, we're talking about a matter where that's really decided by a judge or a tribunal in the church. The key ones would be a marriage sentence or a penal sentence. In my mind, unfortunately, those are sometimes, when a case is decided, those are sometimes called decrees. You may have noticed already in our short time together, the word decree has been used a lot, and it seems to mean something different every time it comes up. Kind of the classical, most specific understanding of decree is an administrative or executive measure. I think we'd be better off if tribunals stuck to the word sentence, but they don't. We're just in this boat together. Sometimes they call them decrees. Okay, in the diocese, the bishop is the chief judge, but he usually appoints a judicial vicar. If he can, he does. It's certainly universal in the U.S. and probably most other places. Judicial power also, it comes with an office. For instance, the office of judicial vicar or the office of judge. It cannot be delegated. Executive administrative authority, say the power to dispense, that can be delegated. But the legislative and judicial power cannot be delegated. So I can't, if I'm named a judge and I want to go to a baseball game on Friday, I can't delegate to somebody else the power to hear the case I'm supposed to hear on Friday. Same with legislative power, cannot be delegated. You personally must possess judicial or legislative power. Again, we just said marriage. Unfortunately, marriage sentences sometimes are called decrees. I wish they weren't, but they sometimes are. Okay, that's really all that we want to talk about right now. And this is why we have this preliminary part, because we go back to our chart. I know you can't read this, but don't worry about it. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that this side, this kind of first column, is on legislative power, and this last column is on judicial power. And we've just essentially covered that. Now we're going to go through it in some more detail on the 22nd when we get together, but they're pretty straightforward. Nothing really that we cover on the 22nd will be new to you. The reason we need this chart, the reason this is a challenge, is because of what's in the middle, kind of these middle three columns, and those are all about executive or administrative powers, general executory decrees, instructions, other types of decrees, who has them, what kind of power you need to issue those things. So the reason for this ground setting is, and I hope it has this effect, is kind of to put you at ease in the sense, even though we're going into a challenging thing, we are essentially talking about the three types of power in the church, and we've pretty much already just covered judicial and legislative, and those were really pretty straightforward. I doubt that much of what we said was surprising to you, and even what you may not have known probably was not all that challenging. But what's more difficult is the executive administrative. So just partly by way, I hope, of reassurance, even though this is going to be somewhat complex or at least involved, keep in mind that we're really only talking about one of the three types of power, and the other two are quite manageable. And I think by the time we get through executive or administrative power, I think you'll find that that's pretty manageable too, though somewhat more involved. Okay, thank you very much.